Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm talking to Dan Osman, who is a coach, a communicator, and a well-being strategist, according to your Instagram bio, Dan. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, my absolute pleasure. Thank you for your patience in making this chat happen. As I said, I'm interested to learn as much as I am share with this one, because I think we've both got quite unique experiences as kind of delved into off the recording. So it'd be good to get into it during it.
I agree. As I was telling you off air, I'm really excited. And dear listeners, the reason why I invited Dan on the podcast today is that I want to discuss body image in men by talking about our respective experiences with it. Because, of course, as you well know, I am a transgender man. So I was raised as a girl. And it took me almost 2 decades, no, more than 2 decades to realize that I was transgender, whereas Dan is a cisgender man, and he is a really big advocate for mental health and the importance of conversations about body image in the fitness space. So to start, Dan, this is what I ask all of my guests, and it is a way to get the listeners to learn a bit more about you. So who are you, what do you do, and why are you so awesome at it?
Oh, I don't know about that latter point. I am a health and wellbeing coach. I think that is the most apt way of describing myself these days. More of a health mongrel. I know that isn't a clear and definitive title, but I've been a specialist of so many things over the years. I kind of pride myself on being more of a generalist these days. So I dipped my toe into the industry as a level 2 health and fitness instructor, wiping sweat off machines. I then led me into PT. I did some strength and conditioning work when I was at university. Much of that was voluntary. That led to a paid job. I went and did S&C work along with an internship at Saracens Rugby Club. When I finished university, that lent itself to some amazing experiences with professional amateur athletes. We worked with, as part of something that's called the TAS scheme, which is the Talented Athlete Scholarship Scheme, which is still a scheme I think is run through universities, which partly funds college and university students with their strength and conditioning, the physiotherapy, and everything else that entails. So I've worked with equestrian sports, archers, divers, football players, worked with Arsenal ladies for a little bit, England netball, developmental squad, as I said, the Saracens, professional boxers, MMA athletes, worked with a real diverse group and kind of realised from that, I didn't know a great deal. I say I didn't know a great deal, only what I'd been exposed to when it came to nutrition. So I went on to do a postgraduate in performance nutrition. Soon realised that it's having this awareness of all these optimals, but largely the broadest part of the population I work with is general population, your kind of corporal athletes. So with all of this very specific knowledge of optimals, I think what led my interest and my own personal exploration in terms of psychology is that it's all kind of irrelevant unless we have a basic humanistic understanding of the individual that we work with. Because there are some people where you can be very directive in terms of coaching, and there are others where it's more non-directive, it's pulling the best out of them. And I guess my experience with performance sport was very directive, is athletes are there to do a job, they have an understanding of what they need to do. They will do as you tell them, even if there's a typo on their exercise plan. Whereas it was a bit of a baptism in terms of emotional intelligence and communication when I would PT, because that wasn't the case. Adherence would be the issue. Consistency was the issue. You speak to people with children, with shift patterns, with all of these other things that are going on in their lives. So that led me to just a real fascination into people and our different experiences. And I've always been quite empathetic, too empathetic, I would say, probably in my early years. And I've tried to develop into being a bit more of a compassionate coach. So my coaching has definitely gone through some evolutions over the years, and that now consists of predominantly coaching people one to one, but more. Don't want to say more. I feel like exercise and nutrition is just scratching the surface with people, more a deeper understanding of what makes them tick, what motivates them, what's going to lead to sustainability, and then getting the longer term health benefits that they're after. I do some public speaking, I do some podcasts, I do a bit of writing, I do a bit of, as I said, health mongrel. And I think that encapsulates it in a nutshell in terms of professionally, my journey.
Thank you for explaining. And I completely agree with you about the importance of understanding a person's psychology when coaching them in the fitness space. And that's exactly what the majority of our conversation will be centered around, I think. And I'm wondering if you could start by sharing, you've shared your professional experience in the fitness space. Now, I was wondering if you could share about your own personal experience with fitness and body image as you were growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess health behaviours weren't really a thing growing up. So I'm from a Mediterranean background, Turkish Cypriot. Both my parents are. So it was. I grew up in a kind of mixed culture, I guess, in that I grew up in Essex on the outskirts of London. Within London, there is a large Turkish Cypriot community, so cousins and family. They were brought up going to Turkish school and learning the lingo, and my real exposure was only with them as family. So I never really felt I belonged there. Also, never really felt like I belonged within, I guess, the archetype English society. There wasn't really a diverse school I grew up in. I was in a much larger body. I think most people go through a phase of, not necessarily a phrase I would use, but puppy fat, I guess, to that becoming more apparent to me the older I got, and that becoming an issue to other people around me. And as it is with people in larger bodies, is they know that they don't need telling that. But when you move into secondary school, people highlight that. That's a distinguishing feature. So I didn't really know where I belonged. My body became a bit of a focus. Back then, it was mixed swimming classes and things like that. And when you're standing around little clothing as a teenager, you are acutely aware of how quickly people are, well, I guess, ahead of you in terms of puberty, but also how different bodies are. Sexuality comes into it, and all of these other things that you're hyper aware of. And that was, again, back in the day of skins versus shirts and being of a much larger, but I didn't really want to engage in physical activity because the sports would involve, getting your kit off or having to have a shower and exposing your body and just feeling a bit conscious of that. So it was much easier just to come up with an excuse not to do it, whether that was sick notes or, asking my mum to do that for me, or whatever that may be. So food became a real comfort for me. And I think that's been a safety behavior, a large part of my life, and still is to a certain degree now. I think when we demonize emotional eating, it's only problematic when it's the only sole means of dealing with difficult emotions. And probably at that time it was. I like to think, like, as a bit older and wiser now, I do have an ability to diverse that coping strategy toolbox. But if I get tired, overwhelmed, stressed, I do recognize my triggers now. Food, and I think that's probably an important point to mention to a lot of people, is something that everyone does. Everyone reverts back to food occasionally. Not everyone, but a large proportion, certainly. And I went to the doctors when I was mid-teens, and forgive anyone who's listened to me ramble on about this before, but the doctor at the time said, you are fat, you need to lose weight. And I went to the doctor about ingrowing toenails at the time. So to hear that, I guess, from an authoritative figure, I got my head around other kids being a bit mean. But when an adult or someone you respect says that, it's quite scathing, it's quite cutting. That didn't warm me to it. It made me revert back, withdraw to doing less of that. And it wasn't until the latter part of my teens I just decided enough was enough. I wanted a real identity switch. It was, I guess, having an interest in girls that never had an interest in me, being hyper aware of my body shape, also not feeling particularly healthy, falling in with a wrong crowd. That probably sounds a lot worse than it is, but recognizing the environment that I was in wasn't really serving me as a person, and wanting to become a healthy individual, a part of that. And I had an interest in performance at the time. So I'm very grateful that my focus was performance initially, but with the byproduct of that being aesthetics. I wanted to change the shape of my body. I wanted to fit into a more of a conventional norm or a societal norm of that. And in my early days of university, a lot of the adopted behaviours I got into physically, I'd improved, I guess, aesthetically, but I'd also found another safety in coping with certain difficult emotions, and that was exercise. Exercise became a crutch, controlling variables around my food. And on reflection, I had a little bit more than a disordered eating pattern. I probably at that stage had a bit of an eating disorder, although it wasn't diagnosed. I was certainly purging through exercise, and but with that came a lot of social reinforcement and applause. I was, for the first time in my life, visible for all the wrong reasons. These people had an interest in me. I was getting a little bit of acknowledgement and praise for how I looked and my discipline and how rigid and structured I was around my food. But that was kind of the first time I became aware of that having implications for my mental health, and how much my body and body preoccupation became a focus, and how hyper aware I was of how that looked around other people. And I go through points of not being able to look at myself in the mirror, or feeling certain parts of my body, or feeling extreme senses of guilt and shame if I didn't consistently adhere to my diet, and binge eating periods, and many other things that came in that started negatively impacting my mental health. And for the first time, depression and anxiety were mentioned to me when I was at university. I went to the doctor, and that was the first time I tried medication for the first time. I think I'll stop there because I'm going back 18 years now. There's a lot to get through, and your listeners don't want to hear me waffle on.
You know, I'm finding it really interesting and intriguing. And what comes to my mind when I'm listening to your story is how many similarities there are between your experience and mine, which up until I was 22 was the experience of a of a woman essentially. Because when I was growing up, I was in a larger body too. And I got bullied for it. Verbally, I never got any degree of physical bullying, but I was verbally insulted and made fun of. And as you're saying, that made me withdraw from exercise and a health promoting eating pattern because I asked my mom to write sick notes for me, and it was also kind of a trend that I noticed among my peers as well. There was a group of us, the nerd group, and we didn't want to exercise. We didn't like exercising. We were the misfits that didn't belong in the exercise space. It was almost a badge of honor to skip
Mm,
PE or physical education. And then when you were mentioning comfort eating, that was probably I actually I wouldn't say I had comfort eating because at the time, or at least at the time, I wasn't aware that I was um, using food to comfort myself. I think I simply had no understanding of how to listen to my body in that I liked to eat and I often overate, and that's how I got into a larger body. But then when I decided that enough was enough and I wanted to, at the time, what I considered that improving my body by getting smaller, when I decided that I wanted to do that, that led me to eating as little as possible and exercising as much as possible. I realized that I had a superpower, which was consistency. I could be consistent at the cost of my own well being. It didn't matter that I didn't want to exercise. It didn't matter that I wanted to eat a pizza. I had a goal and I was going to get there. And once I realized how good I was, I thought, well, if this much is yielding this result, because obviously I was losing weight, more is going to be better, to a point where at my lowest weight I was 82 pounds. I'm 5 foot nothing, so that's not saying much. But 82 pounds is a small weight, an excessively low weight for the majority of people who are 16 years old, like I was.
mm,
And what I think is interesting about the fact that we had similar thoughts and behaviors around our body and exercise and nutrition is that often women and men are portrayed to have a different relationship with their body image, and of course they do have different experiences, but I think what is commonly believed is that women struggle with body image whereas men don't.
mm. Yeah, I would agree with that, and it's becoming more commonplace, I think. And honestly, I don't even think the research reflects how common it is in men because it is still classed as quite an effeminate or female complaint. And stereotypically, I think even when we're talking eating disorders, typically people think thin, white, blonde, middle class women. They don't think, the diverse group of people and human beings that we have on this planet that all experience body image. And I think that is the unifying thing about body image as a discussion is someone has experienced it at some point in their life. I think it's a general impossibility. If you don't mind, can I just ask you a question in terms of the cultural element? Because I always find this a fascinating part because I know there are similarities in different Mediterranean countries. You're from Italy originally,
Yes.
and I found certainly within Turkish communities, one of the first points of reference is how you look. So growing up is I would go to Cyprus and people I didn't even know, like friends of my grandparents would say, "Oh, he's fat." But that was just an okay thing to say, or he needs to lose weight. And it just became a very normalized part of the dialect. And I'm sure like my sister will attest, my mum will attest as well, is that growing up is just everyone comments on your body shape. So it's almost this infrastructure is set up to develop this preoccupation around your weight or your appearance and throw into the mix with that now modern day society, social media, what we're exposed to in the general media, the broader media, and what we spend our days looking at, of course that's going to have an influence there. Again, reiterates the point why body image is such a prevalent complaint in people and concerns around it because everyone's exposed to it all of the time
Hmm.
and it's largely capitalized. These vulnerabilities in people. If we look even at the fitness industry, it is an industry built on diet culture and capitalism, essentially. And that, you know, a century ago, perhaps that began with solely women, but men and how we objectify men is in equal measure to how we objectify women now. Typically boys were always brought up to think about functionality and what they're capable of being big, strong, and fast and everything else. And women, girls, pretty little things that are for men, essentially, to put it crassly, and how that's evolved over time rather than address objectification on a whole. And actually, people are way more than just their body shape, which you and I can both attest to, is it's just, we'll just objectify everyone. And that's
Yeah.
the answer to it.
So I'm wondering, you said that you wanted to ask me a question, but I think I lost what the question was for me.
Sorry, I lost what the question was because I ended up going off on one. In terms of culture, did you find that had a huge influence? Because obviously, as a trans man as well, that must have been incredibly difficult to go through that period. Because I think, for want of a better phrase, in certain Mediterranean countries, that is less culturally accepted to be trans anyway. And then to also go through these concerns with your body image from being in a larger body anyway. Like, well, tell me about that experience for you.
Absolutely. So I was raised in Italy and I moved to the UK when I was 18. So, well, I was 19 at that point to go to university here. And that's where I live now. So I can't speak for what Italy looks like right now because I haven't been for years, if not to just visit my family. But as I was growing up, the culture, there certainly was a large cultural focus on the way that your body looks. But I would say that in my experience, it was different depending on your sex, in that when people had discussions about bodies, if they were talking about a woman who was in a larger body, if they made comments about it, they would usually be scathing comments and they would be made behind the woman's back because it was implied that it was shameful for that woman to be of that size, and as a result of that you wouldn't want to talk to her about her body to her face because you knew that it was shameful. She should know that it was shameful, and therefore she probably was already ashamed, and therefore you wouldn't want to tell her because you wanted to avoid making her feel bad. But then behind her back, it would be commented, her body would be commented upon in a negative way. Whereas the way I obviously witnessed this from an outside perspective, because at the time I didn't know that I was a man, and people around me didn't either. But if I saw my brothers, I grew up with two younger brothers who are both cisgender men, and my dad was around as I was growing up as well. And if I saw them and their experience with their own body, it was accepted to talk about a man's body, a larger man's body, in a facetious manner. So you could make jokes about his appearance to his face, and the jokes would be just as scathing if you really read between the lines as the comments made about the woman. But it was acceptable to make them to the man's face. And in fact, if any man, I would assume, if they had turned around and said, "I don't like you talking to me like that," they would have been called a sissy for not being able to take a joke.
Similar to, I guess, similar to British culture in that way. It's like banter is acceptable, but what's banter and what's just being mean? And I think that's a fine line sometimes because it depends on the person that you're speaking with. Because even now, commenting on someone's appearance, and when I've overheard children speak about other children in that way, is that's learned behaviour. Like, for that to be acceptable, that's not banter. If it makes someone feel terrible, that's not banter. But each, yeah, it's an individual thing, isn't it? And you're going through this experience where, when did you first experience your gender incongruence?
So I it took me years to realize that it was gender incongruence, because as I was growing up, I had no idea that transgender men existed. At first, I started to identify as a gay woman, so a lesbian, and that was when I was about 11. And I only knew that there were people that at the time I referred to as transsexuals or cross dressers, and I believe that they were only people assigned male at birth who dressed up as women, and they believed that they had been born as women. I didn't know that there was a counterpart for people assigned female at birth. So it never even occurred to me that I could be anything but a lesbian. I thought that I fit into that stereotypical lesbian who is more on the what's called the butch side. So I was very tomboyish. I had a very strong personality. I was essentially, yeah, I fit the stereotype perfectly, so it never even occurred to me to question it. The What made me question my gender was, first off, I moved to the UK, and the gender diverse culture here, even at the time, which was 7 years ago, 8 years ago now, it was already much more developed than in Italy. So I met people who identified as gender fluid, transgender, and they were both in a body assigned female at birth and in a body assigned male at birth. So I started to get exposed to more gender identities. And at the time, I was still struggling not with a clinical eating disorder, because technically I was weight restored at the time, and I was also, technically speaking, never diagnosed, but I very obviously fit the DSM-5 criteria for anorexia nervosa. So when I was weight restored, and I also wasn't I didn't I wasn't so far gone in terms of the eating disorder behaviors that I would consider myself having a clinical eating disorder. I still have disordered eating habits, but I was trying to recover from them. From the time I was about 17 or 18 to the time I was 23, I spent those years studying so much about um, eating disorders, intuitive eating, how to exercise in a way to promote your health rather than destroy your body. I never had any type of psychological or medical help. I essentially spearheaded my own recovery all by myself. And what I came to understand was that when I had my eating disorder, I never related to all of the blogs that I was reading. I really wanted to understand where my eating disorder came from. So I was reading a lot of blogs written by girls with anorexia to understand where theirs came from and what they wanted from it. And they kept talking about wanting to be small because that meant they would look pretty and graceful. And I didn't want to be pretty or graceful. I liked to be known as this type of butch lesbian, so strong and tomboyish. And I didn't want to be as small as possible necessarily. So that made me wonder, why is it that I feel the need to engage in these behaviors then? Why does it make me feel good mentally at the time to be at this low body weight, to lie on the side on my bed on my side and feel my hip bone digging into the mattress? And I remember that distinctly. I felt really satisfied whenever I felt that. And I eventually understood that the reason for that was gender incongruence. Because if I thought about what I liked about my state at the time, it was that my chest was flat. I didn't have a period, a menstrual cycle, and I looked more like a boy.
It's really fascinating to hear it comes from that because that's a lot to go through. Anyway, body changes. I think the teenage years as well is because that's when it's brought to the foresight. I think for a lot of people, that's not to mention everything that you was going with, but I don't think any teen knows what's going on with their body really. We're all struggling to find our identity, find our places in the world, and you've obviously paired that with obviously what you was experiencing as well. So to go from a much larger body to a smaller body to obviously this gender incongruence you mentioned as well, but that was the epiphany, was it? It was just that was the epiphany moment for you.
I think that was the moment that led to my, I wouldn't say complete, because I'm not sure that with anorexia nervosa you can make a full recovery in that it changes your neurological pathways in a way that I think is permanent to an extent. So I can't claim that I made a full recovery, but I think that moment was the moment from which I actually began to make a recovery from my disordered behaviors. So not just I wasn't just weight restored, I started making strides towards freeing myself from all of the food rules that I had and all of my thoughts about I if I'm eating this much, I need to exercise this much, to put it in very simple, simplistic terms. And that's when I started actually thinking, okay, then if I can improve upon my gender incongruence, thi- basically I realized this is what I actually want. It's what I now that's why a big part of my coaching now is mindset based, because I've realized that just like I wasn't pursuing fat loss for the sake of it, there was a bigger reason behind it. I want to help my clients gaining insight into what their real reason for wanting to build muscle and bulk up, or wanting to lose fat and get into a smaller body is. Because then they can, I believe that you can make a better distinction, you can better draw the line between what behaviors are actually helping you and what behaviors are not helping you, and they're perhaps driven by societal pressures, for example. Because that was the case for me. So when I went to the GP to get referred to a gender clinic here in the UK, when I finally got access to testosterone replacement therapy, or hormone therapy, so gender affirming hormone therapy is the technical term for it. When I began to build muscle and see my body change in a way that was more in line with who I knew I was inside of me, that's when I also started caring less and less about all of the rules that had chained me for so long. But that's also when I realized that there is a line between pursuing a physical in a way for gender affirming reasons, and pursuing a physical that's a product of societal pressures. So I personally don't agree with an extreme camp that I see in the fitness space that suggests that wanting to lose fat or wanting to build muscle or in any way wanting to change your body is always a negative pursuit. In fact, I help people build muscle and lose fat. It is what I specialize in. I also disagree with the opposite extreme, the camp that suggests that losing fat and building muscle is the only fitness pursuit worth having as a goal. Where I sit is the idea that you have a right to want to change your body, but it's important that you understand where that desire is coming from, because I coach a lot of gender diverse people, and often I notice that they are pursuing an ideal physique that is the physique of a fitness model or a bodybuilder, and they don't know, for one, whether that's attainable at all for them, because there's a lack of education about the influence of genetics and what the costs are of achieving that physique, and also the influence of performance enhancing drugs and how prevalent they are in the fitness space. But also, they believe that by attaining that physique, they will improve upon their gender incongruence. And to me, it's really important to share the message that changing your body can help with your gender incongruence, but the point at which you gain those benefits comes a lot sooner than when you achieve that ideal physique that is often unattainable. And if it is attainable, it's unsustainable for a prolonged period of time.
I think that comes from a lot of this messaging around muscularity is masculinity, which is obviously a fallacy, but a lot of the messaging societally imposed, which is, I'd be really interested to get your thoughts from as a trans man from this point of view. But a lot of the images I was exposed to growing up in the 90s were all of my action heroes were big, muscular. They physically embodied what it was to be a man, to be masculine, to be a protector, to provide. And it was Sly Stallone, it was Arnold Schwarzenegger. I was very much into superheroes growing up. I was very much into anime. If you look at anime, especially, like the proportions are ridiculous. And a lot of the aspirations that we have to look like our favorite characters just isn't possible without you mentioned performance enhancing drugs. There's a distinct lack of transparency in the fitness space, and I'm very much for, same as you, body autonomy. People do as they please. I just think that if you are using your body to market a product and the underlying message is, if you do what I do, you can look like me, then I need to know everything about that. And if you're not telling me everything about that, you're being dishonest. You are the snake
Mm.
oil salesperson. And a fine example of that is the Liver King, because his sole means of making these supplements accessible to everyone was objectifying himself. Look at me, I physically embody everything it should be to be primal, to be a man. If you eat and live the way I eat and you take these supplements, you will look like me. But he was missing out some crucial details. So the fact when that came out that he was, taking certain things, that was no surprise to me. But what I found not too dissimilar to a lot of the fitness influencers that we have in the space is they're arguably doing exactly the same thing. Is look at me, look at how I look at how I live, what I eat in a day, this is my training schedule, this is my arms routine. Let me sell you this product based on me. And that is one of the biggest problems I find we have, because it reinforces all of those beliefs that we should be moving past, and stops people from looking at those things with a healthy level of skepticism. So when we are talking about muscularity being masculinity, it's not, though, is it? Because masculinity could be whatever you want it to be, same as there are masculine and feminine attributes of both in all genders. So yeah, it's a really interesting conversation. Like, how did that influence you as a trans man growing up? Because
So,
you seem to suggest that it was about being smaller and more boy-like. Where did muscularity come into that for you?
so when at the time I was 22 and I realized I fully came out to myself, there was a day when I asked myself, there's a lot of, I toyed with the idea of admitting to myself that I was trans for a long time, but I went through a phase where I identified as gender fluid, because that was, for me, that was the easy way out, in that the way I was thinking about gender fluidity was, well, if at certain times I feel more like a boy, then I identify as a man. If I at certain times I feel more like a girl, then I identify as a woman. But that meant that I didn't have to tell my family. I didn't have to change my pronouns around them. I didn't have to disappoint them, because at the time I believed that it would be a source of conflict with my loved ones. And I like I like it when people like me, and which is very common, but in my case, there is a specific connection. I study personality psychology a lot. I'm very interested in a model called the Enneagram, and according to the my best fit personality type in the Enneagram model, I am extremely conscious about the image that I project to others, and that image is extremely important to me.
To the point that
So
you're more concerned with that to the detriment of yourself.
exactly. So to me, for me to admit to myself that I was trans, I had to ask myself, if I didn't care about what other people thought about my choice, who am I? And my answer was immediate. I didn't even have to think about it. It was, oh, I'd be a guy. That's it. And that's when that was, you know, that meme when your brain explodes.
Epiphany
That
moment.
exactly. It was a an epiphany for me. And at that point I decided, okay, then it doesn't matter what other people think. I'm not going to live my life. I'm not going to live a different life, an inauthentic life, for fear of what other people might think. So at that point, I decided that still wanted to engage with fitness, but I didn't want to do it in a self-destructive way anymore. So I started researching. I love learning, and when I want to find a solution, my go-to is I'm going to learn about this. So I researched exercise and nutrition, and I learned about bodybuilding, but I was exposed to it in a way that I think was really helpful, because my first exposure to bodybuilding was through Dr. Eric Helms, and he has a really health promoting. Obviously, bodybuilding is an extreme sport, but the pursuit of bodybuilding, not of a bodybuilding competition, can be health promoting to an extent. And his approach is very much geared towards promoting the mental and physical health of people interested in bodybuilding. So I think that that for me was really important. And then when I started that bodybuilding journey, rather than the body destroying journey that I had been on up until then, that's also when I joined Instagram. And I started to see other gender diverse people who were really muscular. And that's when the muscularity aspect really came into play for me. And it was interesting because being raised to believe that being as small as possible was the most important aspect of fitness to pursue, the idea that being as muscular as possible was the most important aspect to pursue was very much in conflict with the belief that I had been raised with. And I find that in with many of my clients as well, there's always a an interplay between I want to build more muscle, but when we're in a muscle gaining phase at a certain point, relatively soon actually, if you there's a point where we hit a mental barrier where, oh, now I'm getting larger, I'm getting too large. So there's, and this is common in my cisgender male clients too. It happens to everyone, but it's interesting that the concern with being smaller is seems to be really strong in the gender diverse people who lean more towards the masculine side that I coach. And also I find that difficult when I'm in a muscle gaining phase, for example, to see myself getting bigger, because I for 20 years I was told that if I were small, I that was the ideal physique for me.
Yeah, there's a lot of unlearning still, and I think that's the interesting thing when it comes to coaching is that there's at least this perception that there's this transferable knowledge or with the gatekeepers of secret knowledge, but often people know as much as they need to know. Is unlearning some of these thought behaviors beliefs they have about themselves. But when they've been ingrained for 20, as you say, 20 years, that takes work, and it always surprises me how people are more than happy to meticulously track every morsel of food that goes into their mouth. But when it comes to doing this mindset work and putting pen to paper and putting some of these less tangible practices into play, they're less inclined to do that. But that is arguably what most people need. But they tend to fall back. They revert to, oh, maybe I need a new exercise routine. Maybe I need a new diet. Not, I need to change the way I think about myself and look at my previous beliefs, which is such a important, all-encompassing part of the body image spectrum, because it's all perceptive. It's our perception through the eyes of others. It's like the most torturous things. It starts and ends in our brain. We are in control of that. So irrespective of data and what everyone else thinks of us, unless we choose to believe there's a change there, or we choose to believe we're a healthy individual, or we're happy with our appearances, we all know, and we've probably all been in that position, and I include the listeners there, where someone tells you, I love you the way that you are. And actually, like, nothing about you that I love is anything to do with how you look in your outer shell. I love you for all these other attributes and traits about you. But it's what we think of ourselves. And until that changes in the individual, it's not going to be the new diet. It's not going to be the new exercise plan. It's going to be doing that mindset stuff and challenging these beliefs, because the only way to change these behaviors is to challenge them and these thought processes.
Absolutely, I completely agree. And I have a question for you on this actually. So, if the listeners have been following this conversation and they want to start making this change within themselves to challenge those deeply held beliefs, how would you suggest where can they start?
I think it starts with looking at your personal values and just what's important in life. So even stripping back to that, because I think with identity is an important one to deconstruct as well, because so many people live, and this is where it can become a help and a hindrance, is it can be the self-fulfilling thing if we tell ourselves we are only one thing. And I think a lot of people are in that position in their lives. But by stripping that process back, getting more attuned with what's the individual that I want to be? What do I truly value in life? How do I want to lead my life? How do I want my week on week to lead? We can get a better understanding of what's realistic within that. Because again, it's managing realistic expectations. And then when you have a better understanding from I guess, a psychoeducated point of view of what makes you tick and what your values are, is you can start to look at things that you're exposed to with a healthy level of skepticism. So it's great that I find it inspirational to look at someone, let's just say like Chris Hemsworth, for example. But I've also got to understand there's a huge incentive there. He gets paid millions of dollars to look a certain way. That is his career. There are other things possibly involved in that process. Actually, he has to take months away from his family. That is not the life I want to lead. So, with that, what's the compromise? What am I going to be happy with? Can I be happy with the pursuits and the behaviors involved in that process outside of how it looks? And that's a fascinating one to get into with people, is can you engage in physical activity and being health conscious about how you're going to nourish your body if it meant your body not changing? And if the answer is no, which I think is a travesty and one of the greatest travesties we have in the fitness space, is why is that? Where do these beliefs come from? How can we challenge them? How do you want to think and feel about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. That is excellent. Thank you for sharing that answer. And on the topic of developing a healthy degree of skepticism when looking at what we're exposed to, as I was telling you, in my experience, Instagram was quite transformative in that it was an open door to that led to comparison with other gender diverse men, with other cisgender men, and I believe that comparison is something that we all struggle with to an extent. And it can be so easy to be sucked into it if we're often scrolling on social media nowadays. Because back in the day, when I was growing up, I would see pictures of models in magazines, but I wasn't surrounded by magazines. I couldn't just put my hand in my pocket and pull out a magazine and see, oh, look at all these women and men who look amazing. Whereas now we literally have that. You pull out your phone, you go on Instagram and you can see all of these pictures. And I'm wondering what suggestions do you have for somebody to navigate social media in a way that can be that helps them how to navigate social media without worsening your own body image and how to develop this eye these critical thinking skills to understand what's behind the picture that you're looking at of this person whose body fits societal ideals.
I think it starts with a level of, because this is very individual, right? This level of self awareness, because I am hugely aware that amazing physiques are inspirational for people. People find them a great motivator. So I can't speak for everyone in saying that this is going to worsen everyone's body image, because I don't think that's the case. I suspect longer term, there are huge implications to how we all think and feel about our bodies, our faces, imperfections, whether it's our hairline, whether it's, how thick our eyebrows are or scars on your, all these other things that we tend to focus on based on what we're exposed to on social media. But so I think it starts with understanding how much this has an impact on you. So, does it influence your mood? Do you find yourself comparing yourself in a negative way? Because again, there are people that won't be. There are others that will spend 5 minutes on social media and that will send them into destructive thoughts about themselves. It sends them into a bit of a spiral into what they feel they need to do, how they need to change their diet, how they need to change their bodies, and the lengths they're going to go to. So it starts with how much understanding how much that stuff affects you, right? With the educative process around it, it's understanding, I think, first and foremost, is what's the thing that we're playing with here. We have these powerful devices in our hands. How do we choose to use them? Because if we're basing our reality on what we're most exposed to, if I'm spending hours on my phone every day, I'm sending my coach physique updates, I'm looking at immaculate bodies that you can filter, that you can Photoshop, that they've arguably had a tan, they've dieted for a second. Once I have an understanding of these, I can better establish what reality is and what Instagram is. And with these social media platforms, it's with the beast that it is, and the beast that we're continuously feeding, is what is the purpose behind that post, the motives possibly. So if we're looking at supplement brands, we're looking at athletes they use, that is to make me inspire me to look that way, but it's largely going to be based on something I'm unlikely to achieve. So if that is something that's heavily impacted me, what can I do to reduce my exposure to that? Can I set timers on my social media exposure? Because I think regardless of having this awareness of all the things that we can do to pictures, if we are exposed to it, no matter how aware you are of it, you can't completely shut yourself off for it. We're all susceptible. I have times with my knowledge of body image that I will look at social media, I'll feel a bit crap about myself. And then I'll think, okay, well, maybe I need to stop following certain people or mute certain accounts or try to experience some more of the real world, real connection with people rather than digital connection. And don't get me wrong, there's huge benefits of that digital connection sometimes, but let's separate from real life to um, I often describe it as I find Instagram and social media in general is people chasing evidence of presence rather than just being present. What can you do in your life to be present rather than documenting how to chase it? And, we're all susceptible to this belief that we're putting so much value out into the world. But I think there is, a lot of narcissistic element in all of it for all of us, in that part of us wants just to be seen. And I think that's a incredibly human thing. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. But when we turn to things like social media for external validation and we can't see our worth and value unless we are getting likes on our physique updates, that's an issue. I think it's separating ourselves from social media, not just accounts, but brands that don't use a diverse group of bodies that are reflective of society as a whole. Again, if you're exposing yourself to the perfect all the time, it makes sense that you're always going to compare yourself to that. Having an understanding, I think, from an educated point of view, is not just the influence of social media, but the influence of our peers, the influence of our parents as well. I'm hugely aware as a father how I speak about my own body, not just how I talk about their bodies and other bodies, are going to shape what they think of themselves. I've said it. I feel terrible for saying it, and I often throw my mum under the bus here. My mum is incredibly warm and loving, but she does have a habit of always reminding my daughter how beautiful she is. Of course, I agree. I'm hugely biased. I agree my daughter's beautiful, but I want her to see her value in the world outside of that. We commend her on being incredibly kind, thoughtful, trying her best. We We congratulate her on her functionality. She does something great physically that any boy would. We congratulate her on that. And I think being aware of the language we use around kids, how we talk about bodies. And I used that example earlier of that other child referring to that person across the restaurant as being fat. That child has learnt that somewhere, whether it's from a parent or their peer. And I think when it comes to peers, especially in the fitness spaces, you know, are you in the right company, so to speak, the right environment? So if you are a health and fitness coach and you are more of the well-being side and you're constantly surrounded by physique updates, and you're feeling crap about your own body, that's not going to make you feel any better. So not to disassociate from those people, but put some boundaries in place in what you're exposing yourself to again. Like, have candid conversations with people. I don't want to talk about my body. Do you know what? I'm dealing with a few things now. I'm trying not to talk about it, whether food's good or bad, and just being hyper aware of what negatively impacts you without imposing that on anyone else. I think is I don't want to say it's incredibly selfish, but objectively it has to be when you're preserving your own mental health and your feelings about yourself, and you're really doing that deep work into bettering it and focusing on things like body functionality, what your body is capable of over what it looks. And I think you do have to be explicit with people. Sorry, that was lots of answers in one there, wasn't it?
Oh, but that was excellent. You don't have to
Why?
apologize for answering my questions. No, I thought that was really good advice, to be honest. And just to talk about the final point you touched upon. So you called it selfish, and then you almost corrected yourself. I take issue with people using the word selfish as if it's a bad word,
Mm,
because um, I think that there's too much emphasis nowadays on the idea that we always need to be selfless, and if we do anything for ourselves, that's wrong. And I take issue with that because then it leads to not looking after yourself. And what I always try to tell my clients who are more influenced by this idea than others is that they can't show up as their best selves for the people they love if they're not looking after themselves. And being selfish is looking after yourself. So being selfish, in my opinion, is a neutral term. I'm not a big fan of its negative connotations, because then if we always need to be selfless and we always need to put all of our energy into pleasing other people, then where does that leave us?
yeah, I'd agree with that. And just slightly to counter one thing, and not to counter it, it's just my perspective on it has changed over the years. Is that there's often, especially with the self care narrative, this message that you must take care of yourself so you can take care of other people. There's definitely a facet of it, I believe.
Mhm.
But what I want people to be aware of is self care is selfish, and that is okay because you are worthy of love, attention, fulfilling your needs, desires, wants, whatever that may be, because we all get one shot at this. I do believe part of that is to be of service to people. I do think part of life is contributing to the broader community and society and positively impacting people, but also not for the reason that you should look after yourself for that to look after others, but you should look after yourself because you're worth it as well. You're worthy of love, care, and attention.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I should have said, and I didn't, that when I make that argument is when I'm talking to somebody who's hearing my thoughts on this topic for the very first time. And at that moment in time, they may not be ready to accept the
Mm,
idea that it's okay to do things for yourself. So I find it easier to get through to them if I say, hey, you really care about these people. If you really want to take care of them, then you want to take care of yourself. And then over time, when the person is more receptive to the idea that being selfish for its own sake isn't anything to be ashamed of, then I completely agree with you that we can absolutely do things just for ourselves. Because as you say, we all have one life. And
yeah,
it's fine to want to pursue what we like because we like it, and there's no other reason for it.
yeah. It's even in the, people talk about self care. The operative word is self. You know, a lot of this is self-leadership, bringing the best out of yourself, self-exploration. We talk about all these things about becoming a better human. It starts with self, you know, and that does translate into other relationships in our lives. But when we have a better relationship with ourselves, and that is on the basis of our own needs, is we're better equipped to do all the other things that we frame it around as well.
Absolutely. And I'm very aware that we're up on time, and I just have one last question for you, if that's okay, Dan.
Yeah, of course.
So we started this conversation mentioning the fact that it's more common for women to talk about, or at least to see, body image and mental health associated in the conversation, whereas men, and it is believed, or it was believed for many years, and to an extent it still is, that men don't struggle with body image and mental health in the same way that women do, or even in a similar way that women do. So I'm wondering, you obviously had your own experience with your thoughts about body image and how that affected your mental health as well. And you have taken strides to improve that for yourself. And I was wondering what it is that you did and what suggestions do you have for other men, whether they be gender diverse or cisgender, who are starting to acknowledge I have an issue with my body image. And since nobody talks about it, this is one platform where we are talking about it and we can offer some advice. So I'd be really interested to know about what you would advise other people to do to take steps towards improving their relationship with their body image.
I think you're actually perfectly positioned to talk about this because I echo some of what you mentioned in terms of just being at ease with who you are, what you value in this world, and having a clearer understanding of what you want out of it. So when I think it comes to when I was finding my place and my identity about my body image and acknowledging that was an issue, it was on the basis that I think I had to live up to a version of what other people expected me to be. Or I think on a broader, I can only speak as a cis man, is that what the broader society expects men to be. And part of that conversation is having the vulnerability to speak about this stuff openly. Because just talking in general, whether we're talking about mental health or we're talking about body image concerns, is seen as more of an effeminate thing. So it's not even necessarily a speaking thing. I think even men that are more comfortable with this conversation, it's finding the right ears and the right spaces to talk about it, which I think for me, I didn't find at the time. You know, I think you know, much as you mentioned that you did, is you did a lot of the work yourself in terms of carving out your own identity, what you believed you should be. That is what I believe I did. I didn't have any positive male role models growing up. So a lot of what I based myself on was kind of emulating what I thought I had to be. But then in the process of doing that, realizing that wasn't me. So yeah, being at ease with who you are, but also I think once you are, I find now is I'm because I'm at ease with who I am, because I've been through my own journey, is I want to be, if it doesn't sound too overly indulgent, a role model to other people. Because the only way other men, whether it's trans men uh, or cis men, get this conversation out there is by speaking about it. And I think that provides safety and comfort for other people. So it's, again, curating your echo chamber, who you're exposing yourself to, what messages you're exposing yourself to. Because that, you know, you mentioned Instagram and when you got introduced and being exposed to a gender diverse network is a part of the problem, I think, with anything mental health or body image is you think you're alone. But go out there, seek other people, like-minded people, seek out other environments. It might be that you're not ready to share your own story, but you can hear about other people's stories and there be things that resonate that I think it will give you courage and it does give people courage. And I do think it's also a courageous thing to talk about this thing openly. That's not me saying my own courage, but I think for those people that reach out for the first time and go, I'm actually struggling with this, because that isn't classed as a masculine thing. That isn't classed as a manly thing. As you said, you used the word sissy. You know, for me, I think back to my teenage years growing up in the 90s. If I'd gone to my teacher and said, actually, I don't want to play skins, like I want to play football. I love football. but I'm actually really body conscious. Can I keep my t-shirt on, or can I go on the shirt? I couldn't have done that. The teacher would likely call me a sissy, or other people within my year group would have found that out, and that would have lived with me. And I don't think kids are in that position in school, is to seek out, again, positive male role models that they could have these more candid conversations with. Um, People don't have that relationship with their parents, sadly. So I think there are many dynamics at play, whether it's parents, peers, whether it's social media, that we can just seek out like-minded people, because that is what the internet is fantastic for these days. Is
Yeah.
finding people that are like-minded, whether it's forums, whether it's social media pages, whether it's you know internet searches of local groups that meet up in person. Whatever the support you feel you need, there is something out there, and I think that is a positive of modern day living.
I agree. And in fact, one of the things I like the most about this conversation is that we gave nuance to everything that we touched on. I or you never said fat loss is bad or good, or muscle growth is bad or good, or comparison is bad or it's good, or social media is good or bad. These are all concepts and features of modern day living that per se are neither good or bad, just like food. It's the intent and the use we make of them that makes the difference. And that's something I think is really important for the listeners to take away from this episode.
Yeah, but I find the problem with it, although I think most people's way of thinking, this informed way of thinking, is somewhere in the middle. It is very rational, it is very objective. But what we tend to be exposed to, especially within social media echo chambers, is the most polarized. It's controversial stakes for the point of controversy. It's called rage baiting, and it's incentivized because it's rewarded with social currency. If you put something controversial out there, if you put something really negative, that whether it's for positive or negative reasons, that's going to be shared. That's likely going to go viral. And how people are rewarded with that is traffic, which puts them up
Yeah.
on a pedestal. And I think we can all think of individuals with a certain amount of social currency that promote unhelpful messages that have arguably got there in controversial ways, because it's less about the nuance. It's less about what's actually helpful for people. It is what it is. It is for the basis accumulating social currency. It's accumulating followers for likes, to leverage their insecurities, to leverage their pain and exploit them. You look at most influencers, the job of an influencer is to influence your way of thinking, or at least influence the way in which you buy products and view yourself. So again, that's the healthy level of skepticism, right? Is that when we take information, if it's an extreme polarized either way, whether it's anti-diet, pro-diet, is probably somewhere in the middle. But that's not sexy. That's not sellable. As sellable, I should say. That's the grey.
Exactly. And the problem with social media when it comes to that is that the polarizing views are shared the most. And the way that the algorithm has been growing has created this um, issue where most people will be exposed first to the polarizing views. For example, I don't have a lot of followers. I certainly don't have millions of followers like the Liver King or whoever else who has a very strong polarizing perspective, because I don't have polarizing views. I tell people, if you want to lose fat, you can lose fat. If you don't want to lose fat, you cannot lose fat. And that's not sexy, as you say.
No, and the people behind this, they know exactly what they're doing from a marketing perspective as well. Because I've probably lost count recently, especially, it's like the amount of, and I'll just use an example out there, not the individual that hosts it, but let's just say the Diary of a CEO, for example.
Hmm.
Now, I don't think the host sits there and comes up with titles of all his posts and collaborates those clips together. But the people behind those, they know by putting the most sensationalist bits in that, and putting exercise is awful for losing weight, or exercise is awful for your health. Something that sounds so crazy, it makes you click on it. They know exactly why that's driving traffic. And that is a little bit why I refuse to comment on stuff like that sometimes. I don't want to help their algorithm. A lot of these things, they rely on click revenue. So when you go and watch a controversial clip on YouTube, you are contributing towards money in their pocket. So we're not helping ourselves with this. So when fitness professionals are doing exposés on what other people's content is doing and the worst sort of advice out there, you're just driving traffic towards it. And I know it's easy content, so I always try to challenge the ideas and not the actual people behind it, because I don't want people drawn to that content. That's not what I'm about.
I agree. And Dan, I'm aware that if I kept talking to you, we would probably go on for 3 hours, but you've already been really generous with your time. So I'd like to give you a space now to tell all the listeners where they can connect with you if they so wish.
Yeah, Instagram is probably the most accessible, I think, to most people. the.dan.osman. Have to double check that every time I say it out loud. I have my own podcast, Dan Osman's Ramblings of a Madman. I co-host, we haven't recorded in a long time, Fitness Unfiltered, with a GP and
Emma
another
Story
health and
Gordon.
fitness. Yeah, people might be familiar with Emma. Yeah, and LinkedIn generally. I have a blog, I have an email list, and I share things by that. So yeah, I'm always happy to answer any further questions to anyone that does listen and find this interesting. And I thank you for opening up the conversation. Kind of a point we spoke about, which we didn't get a chance to mention again. Pre-recording, was this opening spaces for people just to get stuff wrong. I used, and I don't mind using an example, I used gender dysphoria when we started speaking, and you were quite kind in correcting me and saying that actually the preference is gender incongruence these days. And I thank you for that, because I think one of the biggest issues, especially with cancel culture at the moment, and we could talk about body image, and there'd be examples relating to that, but part of this conversation of not people not opening up, not having these conversations, not having safe spaces, and the permission to get things wrong and not be called an idiot. So I think that's a really important point to take away from it, is that we all learn from that, and I learned from that today. So thank you.
No, you're very welcome. And just to clarify, when I mentioned gender incongruence, what I meant to say is that gender incongruence is the newest term, which is starting to become popularized. A lot of people in the gender diverse space will still use gender dysphoria, and that's fine. And
Right.
it is my personal preference to use gender incongruence because I feel that it better explains what it is that I personally experience as a gender diverse person, but that my experience is not everybody's experience, and I don't think that using gender dysphoria or gender incongruence is necessarily right or wrong. In the end, these are terms that try to encapsulate an entire human experience, which I think is one of the limitations of our language, the human language. It's really hard to come up with just one word to explain
Mm.
what a human feels.
Yeah, but that said, that is important to me anyway, because for the sake of this conversation, that is your preference. And I think some people have a real issue with, pronouns and what people prefer to be called these days. And it's no skin off my nose. I'm having a conversation with you. We're both humans. I want you to feel as easy and as comfortable as possible. Whether or not gender dysphoria is the incorrect phrasing, the fact that you said actually my preference is gender incongruence, that's a huge important element of this, much of what we're talking about coaching wise, communicating with people on their terms. If someone has a preference, that's how I'm going to talk to them. And I think that's an important point to take away from it.
I agree, and I think conversely, an important point for me to take away, for well, an important point to take away is that I also want you, as the person who's talking to me, to feel comfortable asking me questions about it. Because if I were to shut you down and call you an idiot, then you would stop asking questions. And if anything, you might even become resentful towards transgender people because you were mistreated by them. So, whenever a cisgender person wants to learn, I try to be extremely aware that if they say something that I might disagree with or that might feel hurtful to me, it's coming from a place of trying to learn and a place of current ignorance. And if I don't make an effort to change that in a compassionate way, then we're just going to fight a war instead of trying to learn from each other.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, that dynamic is such a huge part of most things, isn't it? It's just, I see that as just mutual respect. As I said to you off air, is if I got something wrong, someone called me an idiot and I didn't want to learn and something, I probably would just withdraw. I'd just say, okay, well, I'm just going to avoid that conversation entirely in future, rather than, okay, like you've taken the time to say, well, actually, this is another way. I don't feel stupid for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that note, Dan, thank you so much for your time. I will add all of the links that you've mentioned to your two podcasts, LinkedIn and IG, Instagram, to the show notes. So dear listeners, if you want to talk to Dan, he's very friendly, as I'm sure you've been able to glean from this conversation. So reach out to him via the show notes. Thank you so much, as always, for being so generous in lending me some of your time today to listen to this podcast. Thank you, Dan, for being a part of it. And until next time. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.